This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
So I want to thank Bob and Peter Mack for a wonderful conference so far. It's been very lovely. In the spring semesters between 1985 and 1996, Michael Baxandall taught in the Department of the History of Art at the University of California, Berkeley. Undergraduates took his lecture course, and graduate students in art history, and his own preferred department, rhetoric, filled his seminars. Generous with undergraduates and graduate students alike, he was open in his admiration of the democratic nature of our sprawling state university, a good corrective for us Americans who took such things for granted. Camping out in a different office every year, Baxandall taught largely without the apparatus of books and file cabinets that played a prominent role in most people's office hours. Studying with him was as conversational and dialogic as he described good art history to be. Teaching was understood in the sense of showing rather than telling, of providing conditions in which information could travel. But most importantly, he taught how to ask questions, teaching how to be curious in an educated way. To discuss Baxandall's legacy from the point of view of an art historian is for me a daunting task that also seems somewhat redundant in 2012. As a field, art history has endowed Baxandall's work with particular authority so that some of his books are standard reading in classes like the ones I teach. They've attracted a certain amount of pushback, as we've been hearing, although in no way congruent with the force his work has exerted on the discipline. None of the criticisms about what his books fail to include have so far diminished the opportunities they continue to provide to the students who read them and the faculty who teach them. But especially now, when the importance of humanities teaching turns out to be so difficult to articulate, and because all teaching, although it lodges in people, is ephemeral in its manifestation, it seems that a discussion of its role as part of Baxandall's intellectual legacy could be an interesting addition to that conversation that might otherwise be overlooked. On balance, Baxandall's graduate teaching at Berkeley looked like the image on the left more often than that on the right. Both of these woodcuts, of course, appear among the many images of teaching and other forms of communication that illustrate painting and experience, a book that, as his TA for a lecture course given in 1989, I helped to teach. This is the syllabus from that 14-week lecture course, striking today not only for having been written on an antique writing instrument, but also for its singular brevity compared to the 4- and 5-page documents that American professors are now obliged to produce. The textbooks were Frederick Hart's chronologically driven tome on Italian Renaissance art, and Baxandall's own slender volume that ranged around in the brain of Quattrocento viewers of art, pointing out possible high points of neural activity when pictures came into view. For this book, Hart became an expanded picture atlas and useful resource for facts that we could not expect to discover stored in Quattrocento minds. No one ever complained about having had to buy it, and a lot of students consulted it regularly. It was comforting in that nothing that they then proceeded to say about Renaissance art was expressly contradicted in that volume. At the first class meeting, a paper was assigned. Students were asked to visit the University Art Museum, where there was an exhibit about the art of the Sforza court in Milan. The assignment went like this. Identify an object that intrigues you and write a 3-page essay about what knowledge about its circumstances, function, or techniques of making might or might not be useful in the understanding and perception of it. Also think about what sort of information would not help get things moving. From the first week, students were put on notice that responses to art in the form of questions to ask were important enough to constitute a formally written essay. The curriculum took off in week 2 with a discussion of how workshops acted as schools, looking at the practices and working conditions of Renaissance artists, as well as the similarly informed choices humanist educators made who lived and worked in cities or courts. Commissioners, either final or efficient causes of art being made, were then discussed in terms of the nature of their relationships with artists. Baxandall greatly preferred the word commissioner to patron, which belonged more to anthropology, he said, than to art history. He felt that the use of the word in art history short-circuited inquiry by discouraging investigation about the skills and styles of commissioners, which we looked at in different embodiments for 2 weeks. In weeks 5 and 6, we dealt with color and space in terms of intellectual activity. Perspective, or as he called it, the smothering of things in space, was introduced as a special case of proportion that involved a handout about rhetorical terms and a discussion of Polycletus, Pacioli, Dürer, and musical harmonies, before coming to rest at Alberti, where we stayed the entire following week. Instead of having lectures then, we did close readings of Alberti together, the way you might read him in a literature class, with the book in hand, paragraph by paragraph. We moved from medieval optical theory to Renaissance color theory by way of a vocabulary for color from our own time but not our own discipline, using words like induction and constancy. There were 4 classes on art criticism, weeks 10 to 11 on the syllabus, which might surprise someone who'd read his judgment that it was, quote, a minor literary genre affected by generic constraints, end quote, but that was for the 18th century. In the 15th century, it was still vernacular workshop argument without its professional jargon and academic apparatus. In these classes, we discussed Vasari, focusing on the education of vernacular writers outside universities, and we followed Vasari's descriptive style with this in mind. This kind of art criticism, of a conversational and dialogic quality in itself, proceeded from the following 3 main questions. 1. Who's best? 2. What is good anyway? And 3. What is the relationship of good art to other things? The lecture class was an original and synthetic introduction to the concepts in his first 4 books. In graduate seminars, he did not discuss art in this way, but recommended reading Gramsci on the organic intellectual. If you took both classes and read all his books, you could figure out why. On art history exams, Baxandall effectively disabled the usual student response by providing all the data they would otherwise have memorized, much as museums did, and therefore making the slides an opportunity for putting into practice the kinds of discriminating looking he described in his book. Borrowing a descriptive language from literature, rhetoric, mathematics, and geometry by way of Landino, Alberti, Giovanni Santi, and Lancelotti, students made the language their own. This required understanding the part of speech of each unfamiliar word and using it perceptively in their own humanist assessments of Renaissance paintings. By talking the talk, students found themselves walking the walk, an important byproduct of which was that they came to understand, by embodying it, the importance of language in art historical analysis. In an interview in 2006, Baxandall was asked what he thought about the role of museums, and his response closely matched what I think of as his teaching style. He said then, quote, "My feeling is that what would be useful is if museums fed public curiosity about why people wanted to do these strange things, and not instruct people, but construct an ambience where people actively think about what was intended. My personal feeling is that people, including myself, can't avoid curiosity about the intention behind objects, and they can't avoid evaluations. And these 2 things coming together become very powerful. So I suppose I'm arguing for making intriguing ambiances and leaving people alone." Seen in this way, painting an experience was a guide, but not a method, for learning how to formulate productive questions about pictures. As such, it was a good user's guide for heart, which in California, where we were largely without Quattrocento paintings, stood in for Renaissance art. In college, my printmaking teacher told us about how in Texas, when 2 men had an issue to address, they would meet at a fence to talk about a cow in the field in front of them, and how when they parted, having talked about nothing else but the cow, they would have discovered every issue of importance that they needed to discuss. The importance of developing the capacity to make pictures generative topics of human interaction, rather than pronouncing about them, meant that you could address large and mysterious concepts through engaging your visual and conversational functions in inquiring ways. Baxandall made this point in Patterns of Intention and in Painting and Experience. But writing in 1979, he willfully used the pronoun we in talking about the way art historians do it. In the language of art history, he wrote that we have a natural vulgar street. In every group of travelers, every bunch of tourists in a bus, there is at least one man who insists on pointing out to others the beauty or interest of the things they encounter, even though the others can see the things too. We are that man, I am afraid. It remains a constant source of amazement to most people, as it did to Baxandall, that what we see when we look at things is not what anyone else sees. Just because people, even very smart people, can see things is no guarantee that they know how to be interested in them or want to be interested in them. But to teach art history means that you're teaching people who are already well disposed to wanting to become interested in pictures. And to mount a museum exhibition similarly presupposes that your audience would like to see things in a new way. I had an opportunity to test Baxandall's teaching mode against a particularly impenetrable seeming example this past semester in an undergraduate class on early modern festival and carnival. The class will culminate in an exhibition of prints about the festive city at an art museum. Baxandall's ideal museum was an anthropological museum, but the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design comes close, with an in-house specialist audience of students who care deeply about cities and are particularly agile practitioners of disegno for fields ranging from fine arts to architecture, glass, and design. Although the exhibition will also festival books, it's centered around a collection of indifferently printed etchings in depressing condition that had appeared in Paris, usually on the 28th and 29th of June, almost every year from 1722 to 1780. They were made in Rome as part of the celebration of a solemn festival that also had some carnivalesque qualities called the Canea. We spread the prints out on a table and began a speculative conversation that is still going on. I am curious about all prints, but experience shows that inspiring curiosity in students about monochromatic two-dimensional objects that don't move can be challenging. These are pictures of ephemeral stage sets that were actually designed to be blown up with fireworks, as we shall see, but there's little on the face of them that gives that away. Our unpromising task, therefore, was to promote curiosity on the part of our students and communicate it through them to the museum-going public in the static quality and abundant quantity of Canea prints. Were extraordinary events by definition, and staging them required great expense and a lot of work, usually narrated in written accounts in mind-numbing detail. Festival books proudly announce the amount of wood used in building temporary scaffolding to seat thousands of viewers, dead for centuries but identified by name. Or they list the hundreds of dishes at the feast, as in this helpful diagram of the banquet tables at Westminster celebrating the coronation of James II. Abundant information is available in official printed narratives, as well as from the letters of impressed travelers and the observations of literary locals. Not only does this make it possible for historians to report to readers about the stirring aspects of festivals not immediately available in printed illustrations, but also likely that they will want to do so because its cultural history is really interesting. One of the attractive things about festival books and prints is that they go to great pains to seem to be directly indexical to an occasion that no longer exists. The pull through the surface, past the representation to the thing represented, is very strong. The prints, many of them made by unknown artists, do very little to cue a positive aesthetic response, and there's little precedence in art historical writing for that kind of response. It's as if at some point we mutually consented to ignore the look of festival prints in order to mine them for information about the events. Festival prints are very rich sources, and much of the writing on them is really good cultural history of architecture, print culture, and theater history. So the usual response to pictorial festival-related representation like this print of the second set piece for the Kinea Festival of 1747 is to discuss the architecture of the palaces in the background, or the concetto of the allegorical stage set made of papier-mâché and canvas in the foreground. They can also move past the overwhelming quality of most of these prints, filling in emotive aspects and discussing the sensory experiences that the prints fail to record visually, information which is available elsewhere. This would include the color of the fake and real greenery that almost imperceptibly covered this fortress-like garden, or the fountain spouting real water at the base, and the lifelike quality that expert painting lent the papier-mâché rocks and the stucco statues gleaming with gold and silver paint. In written description, it is the lifelikeness of the elements in these set pieces that's insisted on as much as any other aspect of them. The Kinea prints differ from the prints in festival books, first in that they're single-sheet prints, and therefore the only information we're given about them is inscribed in a formulaic caption engraved at the bottom of the print, or else in news pamphlets published in the weeks of the festival. Festival books with pictures like the one for James II's coronation are instead often elaborate volumes of illustrated text. The second difference about Kinea prints is that they've been thoroughly investigated as historical documents, primarily by John Moore, who's written a perceptive documentary study of the visual culture of the Kinea Festival, making it available to English-speaking undergraduates, among others. Armed with more information about the role of prints in the festivals than we would ever have from a festival book, it was now our job to say something about them, working on the visual register, and this proved to be difficult. The word Kinea means a horse of ambling gait, and a horse is also a symbol of the city of Naples. From the 11th century to 1885, the rulers of Naples and Sicily presented the Pope annually with a tax in return for sovereign rights to southern Italy. For about a century, the presentation of this tribute took the form of an elaborate ceremony staged as a civic festival by the princes of the Roman Colonna family, acting as ambassadors from the King of Naples to the Papal See. On June 28th, the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, a silver flower was balanced on the back of a richly caparisoned white horse, the Kinea, that was led in procession with enormous pomp and the noise of many drummers, trumpeters, firecrackers, and cannons from the Palazzo Colonna at first and later from the Palazzo Farnese city into the Vatican. There the trained horse would kneel before the Pope, who accepted the tribute consisting of trained horse, silver flower, embroidered horsecloth, and a deposit certificate in an embroidered bag from the King of Naples. This confirmed the sovereignty of the king over Naples and Sicily for one more year. At staggering expense, the Colonna princes commissioned not only the cavalcade itself, but also the construction and dramatic destruction of two elaborate set pieces. Here's one. First in the piazza of the Colonna family palace, or as you see in this topographically abbreviated representation in front of the Palazzo Farnese, which became the seat of the Neapolitan embassy in Rome after 1734. From 1722 to 1788, the Colonna also broadcast the joyful conclusion of this act of tribute throughout the city and to the major courts of Europe by publishing well before the event and distributing before and after the event a pair of etchings of the set pieces. They were also called macchine di gioia, borrowing the term macchina, or machine, from theater sets that were designed to move on the stage. They were fantastic works of ephemeral architecture built out of wire and wood, plaster, papier-mâché, and painted canvas. The themes were usually allegorical or mythological, praising Naples and Sicily, or expressing the virtues of the king and queen, personal triumphs of the royal family, or advances in commerce, technology, and government. Most were lofty, such as images of Parnassus, or Temple of the Gods. Some evoked explosions and fire in terms of natural or military destruction, such as Mount Vesuvius or the Trojan horse. These also went well with their functions as the base for extravagant fireworks displays. In this architect's drawing of the Seconda Machina of 1733, we see Jove and Minerva at Vulcan's forge, a subject that was both mythological and smoky, allowing for the display of weapons and trumpets that could be noisy, as well as providing a spiky decorative silhouette for fireworks. On the eve of June 28th for the first Machina, and again the following evening for the second, fireworks embedded in these set pieces were activated to provide a fabulous entertainment of copious, varied, and vigorous salvos that were described as continuous and deafening. Crowds gathered in the piazza throughout the afternoon, admiring the set piece in its final moments of calm and drinking wine dispensed by real hunchbacks, perhaps imitating Punchinello figures, presiding at a fountain set up for that purpose. The set piece was designed to provide an explosive spectacle that selectively destroyed itself in parts while leaving the bones of the apparatus intact so that the second machina could be assembled rapidly on top of it before the following evening. The costs and effort related to the army of designers, builders, decorators, and stage managers and the materials they required was formidable. The fireworks and illuminations alone, each listed in payment records by its own wildly descriptive name, numbered in the thousands. Even taking these expenses into account, the payments related solely to the manufacture and distribution of the Kinea etchings were appreciable, since the prints were made from the same drawings that would then be turned over to the head bombardier at the Castel Sant'Angelo, so he could construct the base for his fireworks. The image was designed months before the set pieces were finished. One print was always printed on silk and edged with gold lace by the Colonna family tailor, and I'm showing you this just so you can see how deeply, deeply unfamiliar these items are for us. These were the presentation prints for the Pope and the King of Naples and one or two other people. In spite of the inclusion of people scattered across the bottom of almost every print, vignette-like, which gave the scene a sense of scale even when there was no other architectural information, the print showed the plan for the set piece rather than a documentary record of the set piece in the piazza at the time of the festival. In this way, such prints differed greatly from retrospective accounts of entries or weddings in full-scale festival books. Those books were often organized specifically to show the effort and attention to detail that eventually resulted in an experience brought about through artifice that was more marvelous than one could find in nature, a godly experience with cosmic music and Jove-like thunder. So festival books dwelt on the work and the ingenuity, the artifice behind the spectacle. This etching by Jacques Blondel from a French festival book shows the climax of the festivities staged in Paris along the Seine for the celebration of a royal marriage in 1739. Preceding pages contain meticulous diagrams, including measurements and ground plans. They walk the reader through a detailed account of the design and construction of most aspects of the spectacle, dwelling on the building of a much vaunted music pavilion in the middle of the river. That floated on barges lashed together and covered with false rocks, lit from within through a scrim of multicolored transparent fabric, and contained orchestra that played all afternoon. Much attention was given to descriptions of the individual designs for ornamental illumination of the many boats that lined the river, each different and each kept lit for the entire night next to three-tiered fountains that jetted river water continually to the height of the boats. Even so, the author took care to inform readers about the vigilant security measures that robbed the remaining darkness of its more sinister aspects. It was said that the many magnificent fireworks turned night into day for hours on end, reversing the order of nature. This pyrotechnic feat is registered throughout the print in attention to the effects of light and shadows and reflections everywhere. These deafening fireworks are rendered with all the smoke and crackle, explosive force and splendor promised in the list of incendiary devices in the accompanying text, which mentions cascades of fire, crazy rockets, and shooting stars, among many, many others. Presented at the end of a detailed description of all the parts of the spectacle, the overall view of the city transformed by fireworks takes on the sense of a perfectly orchestrated symphony on a grand scale, for which the music pavilion stands as a more civilized metaphor. The Kinea prints, especially against the background of other contemporary renditions of joyous festivals, seem distinctly less joyful. All the events promised free wine, music, fireworks, and a mixture of popular and elite participation that contemporary sources describe in the same appreciative language used in the French festival book. Even given that there was a conventional language for admiring these celebrations, even given that published sources would be written before the event or by people who had not actually attended it, and even understanding that the prints record the clear and instructive plans made by the architect for the set builders, the distinct reticence on the part of the printmaker to evoke the sound, lighting effects, or even the crowds reported to have filled the piazza is a matter of wonder. These prints from 1765 and 1763 by Giuseppe Vasi, recording set pieces with carnival themes, are among the liveliest of the group. We see a bolting horse in the top print and an actual rendition of fireworks in the bottom, one of only 2 such representations out of the 108 known Kinea etchings, shown here against an evenly cloudy but not dark sky. Any potential of fireworks to turn night into day or to deafen crowds is visually absent here. These symmetrical bouquets of fireworks disrupt Vasi's even-handed screen of sky in such a way that we begin to doubt whether we're looking at a picture of real fireworks or if the whole thing is a painted backdrop complete with trees in the far distance and a certainly unreal carnival parade in the foreground. In 1788, when the Neapolitan king Ferdinand IV definitively put an end to the Kinea spectacles, calling the tribute ceremony an indecorous shackle of a chimerical feudalism, the part of the festival that the Roman people seemed to miss the most was the fireworks display. There were over 6,000 of these fireworks embedded in each set piece, but you would never know it from the Kinea prints. Giuseppe Vasi's deadpan line work is not an Italian convention. The Venetian printmakers especially seem to care about pressuring their printed lines in novel and signature ways. What in Vasi's work would compare with the short stippled flecks that distribute light over an array of varied shapes and textured surfaces, as you see in Tiepolo, or the richly massed contoured sheaves of line from which Piranesi constituted shadow, brick, and bristle, or the swashy loops that served Canaletto for the figures, foam, clouds, and reflections that was so necessary to his Venetian views. In 1749, the King of Naples needed a festival book made to record a real cuccagna that he commissioned to celebrate the birth of an heir. Piranesi gave it a try, but the king pronounced it truly terrible and gave the job to Vasi, a Sicilian from Corleone. To the question, who's best? The answer, as far as the King of Naples was concerned, was clearly Vasi. From 1749 on, Vasi held the title of royal printmaker to the Bourbon court, and an enviable apartment in the Palazzo Farnese, where he lived and had a studio here. The etchings were printed on the first floor of the building, and from a balcony right here, over the central doorway, Benedict XIV had once spent part of an afternoon in 1745 comparing his silk and gold lace impression of an etching with the set piece he could observe at his leisure, a comparison of the real set piece with its representation that was described as a delightful activity and something people like to do with their prints. The overt, flat-footed fakeness of the Kinea prints signals the conflation of the real and the false on several registers, something that was remarked on as a source of pleasure for viewers. In printed relazioni and in letters, the lifelikeness of the architecture of the Kinea prints emerged in appreciations of the simulated marble or the truly stony-looking stones acknowledged in the same sentence to be made of stucco. The papier-mâché figures on the balustrade on the top that emulated statues were painted to look like marble or bronze. Frame-breaking additions like painted fountains that jetted real water or real lamps inserted in painted architecture were also admired. And in pieces like this one, the second structure displayed and ultimately destroyed in the Piazza Farnese in 1761, the sound of music that filled the piazza from actual musicians inserted among the stucco ones prompted descriptions in the Relazione of the false musicians and the painted spectators watching them from their boxes as confoundingly real. The set piece represented, quote, a festive theater of music, in no way deformed from real life, neither in its symmetry and proportion, nor in the exquisite pictures of the scene where it could easily surpass a real theater. It wasn't only the theater itself that formed the spectacle. The scene had people who, even if mute and of stone, represented nonetheless perfectly in their clothing, their attitudes, and perhaps also in their likeness, known actors. Mute like this, they could not be said to be speaking, but they aroused a pleasure in the soul proportionate not only to the memory of something pleasant, but also in the exact correspondence of the fake with the real. Indeed, as regards the orchestra, when it was finished off with a quantity of stucco musicians, nothing was lacking because no other pleasure was given besides this one that arose just from admiring them. But their inaction was supplemented by as many real players who from time to time could be heard repeating some of the harmonious symphonies that accompany the renowned opera. In the center, then, a painted backdrop representing a popular opera as acted by recognizable actors cavorting in a painted garden was painted in enough detail so as perhaps to be recognizable to the real public, signified by the lowest tier of arriving carriages. Vasey takes care to signal the artifice in all this confabulation in his single-sheet print, just as the festival books made much of the construction of their fantastic ambiances in their illustrated volumes. The emphasis on artifice is a consistent feature of Vasey's Kinea prints that also seem to deflate attempts we make to find them lifelike, as they were, in our sense of the word, as contemporaries claim to have done. Therefore, on the left side of the stage, the depiction of viewers in their boxes in shadow conforms to the flat surface of the canvas stretched across the wooden frame of the fireworks base. On the other side, the viewers are shown brightly lit, emphasizing the illusion of depth and causing viewers of the print to wonder if on the right side of the image the print represents viewers as flat paintings on canvas, or if here they become stucco figures in boxes. It could be either, or they could represent the illusionistic effects of real lamps playing on trompe-l'oeil painting, all things that regular festival goers would expect to see. The painted backdrop with its recognizable actors is rendered in a flurry of curving lines that signify painterliness. Below are the stucco musicians playing stucco instruments painted to look real, which, since we know they were there from time to time, may also include actual human musicians playing real music from the painted opera, but we can only guess at which ones are real and which ones are fake. Something we already know from the descriptions was held to be one of the amazements and pleasures invited by the set pieces. In the audience in the boxes, seen enjoying their last moments of worldly pleasure before being blown up at nightfall, the audience in the piazza can feel an anticipatory, perhaps moralizing thrill, signaled in the smoke already issuing from the plaster vases on the balustrades. On the balustrades, too, are the last tier of living forms, presented as stucco or papier-mâché mythological figures, such as putti, two-tailed mermaids, and timeless-looking women imitating antique sculpture made of stone. Between 1729 and 1750, that is, up to the year after Vasey became royal printer, a subset of the Kinea prints that people have not cared much to talk about. Most of them were designed by pensionnaires of the French Academy in Rome. Rather than emphasizing the set designer's triumph of artifice and ingenuity in constructing elaborate allegorical fireworks bases in the familiar piazze, they presented viewers with allegorical and mythological scenes as if they were actively taking place. Leaving out the architectural framework altogether, they concentrated on the fantastic scenes as if they were indeed live actors swarming towering stage sets for an immersive dramatic production, or at least an ambitious tableau vivant. If you were familiar with the genre, you would recognize the Kinea dressed up as Pegasus and assumed that the craggy home of the gods was staged atop a monumental arch, but you needed to be in the know. The expense of the Colonna family and the ingenuity of the bombardiers go by the wayside in favor of activating the fulsome allegories. In the end, there was a clear preference for the image of the stage set, emphasizing its constructed nature, but without the framework of the permanent architecture. This is explicit in the fact that after 1750 and the advent of Vasey, with exactly one exception, this was the model for every Kinea print. The format answers the second Baxandallian question, what is good anyway. The students in my seminar decided that just as Quattrocento viewers would be used to gauging barrels and assessing ultramarine, Settecento viewers would be used to trying to distinguish between what was documentary and what was fabulation. There were really fireworks, but did they look like this? Was there really a carnival parade? In the festival prints, Settecento viewers would look for what was three-dimensional and what was backdrop, which was the effect of real lighting and which was painted, just as they would admire these tricks in a stage set. After 1750, they would be doing this without the distinctive geographies of the set piece's temporary Roman surroundings, or any indication of the known space they occupied. A good deal of this particular structure, contracts show, was a flat canvas that was painted on both the front and the back so that the noble viewers inside the palace would have the same view as the crowds in the piazza. But there's no way to know how much was painted canvas. Part of it purports to be painted canvas, the backdrop for the stage. At the very least, the print shows a painting of a painting, but it may also show a painting of a stage with its scene and actors and audience, and your guess is as good as mine about whether it was a painting of stucco musicians and papier-mâché statues. It certainly is a print of that. It complicates in several ways the answer to the third Baxandallian question: what is the relationship of good art to other things? The evenly calibrated, impassive prints that give little away about the experience of the magnificent celebration at the expense of the Colonna show us at the same time il finto e il vero. Vasi's regular lines keep those distinctions in tension, depicting the fake and the real without distinguishing much between them. We have the print because it was sent to somebody who saved it, a gift of curiosity filtered through Vasi's uniform linear screen. The person who turns to look at us from the fine carriage that hurtles towards a blind door made of vertical lines, isn't he worried like we are that there might not really be a door there? Where's he going at such breakneck speed? To join his painted companions in the magnificent theater of music, through the looking glass into the Farnese Palace on the other side? Folded into albums, as virtually all of these prints once were, to be looked at with friends, these Kinea prints trade in the same visual tricks as those masters of illusion, the festaiuoli. If they're lacking as documents of the festival experience, they're interesting documents of the viewing experiences, both of stage sets in public and of prints in more private settings. They are not only representations of an act of perception, as Baxandall wrote about Chardin, or in this case, willed misperception, but a machine in themselves for remobilizing the kind of perception in viewers of the prints. It's no longer a game we really want to play, and it becomes clear that Vasi did not make these prints for us. But if we enter into the Kinea prints not wanting them to be Blondel or Piranesi, but looking at Vasi's signature lines as effects with which he posed riddles in an intentional visual language, we then gain access to a variety of early modern curiosity on its own deeply unfamiliar terms. We've sharpened our sense of the pictures and are able to create the conditions for a dialogue about them. Thank you.
As we did yesterday, take some questions.
Yeah.
How did these, so you said that these are designed as plans. How do they differ from records of the...
I'm sorry?
How do they differ greatly from records of the festivals?
The only, there was a lot of writing about them from the prints, and writing by people who weren't there but assumed that they would be there. So the contemporary writing concentrates on the concetto of the allegories, but there was enough writing by people who said that the prints looked nothing like the stage sets, that we know that things were changed or that people could be dissatisfied with that. But they were probably of the same concetto. Yes, Peter?
This title of being royal printmaker, did he have other tasks, or was it...
He was also the head of the guardaroba.
Yeah.
Oh, and as royal printmaker, he did other festival books for the King of Naples. He did festival work for him, but this was his main royal task.
So the main thing each year was to produce one of these.
2 of these a year.
And he would be somehow discussing this with the designers.
The designers it was quite dispersed, the authorial responsibilities for these. There was an architect, then the bombardier was actually in charge of hiring all the workers to make the set. So he was really the main guy. There was a whole group of painters. There was the person who made the drawing, often from the architect's model. And then there was Vasi, or whoever the printmaker was. And then there was a printer. And then there was somebody who did the captions. And there's a possibility that there was somebody who did the vignette figures in the foreground. So there could have been many, many people working on this print. There definitely were many, but we don't know exactly how many. Yeah.
Bombardiere was the man in charge of the fireworks. Is that the
Yeah.
ufficiali? Because what's striking is in a way the complementarity of architecture and fireworks. The fireworks are kind of anti-architecture, but at the same time a supplement to the architecture.
Yeah.
That's what Vasi's prints make clear, that they function, that the fireworks are made to function like an extension of the architecture. They're symmetrical and so forth.
Yeah, and it had to blow up in parts so that they could save bits of it for the second one. Then they stored them in the Carracci room in the Palazzo Farnese until the next year so they could reuse them. Yeah, no, I mean, the thing that's interesting is people like to, what interested us is that all the writing about these tried to look through the print to see what the stage, what this might have looked like in a piazza. And clearly the preferred person to do these was somebody who ignored the piazza, because the earlier prints had, as I showed you, images of the Palazzo Farnese, images, something that emphasized the artifice of the thing and invited you to think about it that way. This one gives you the idea in the base and in the, as you said, the very stage set like design, but it's done with a facture that is so even-handed that there's no way to figure out where it is, how it existed, what the scale is, except for the little people in the front who you take to be real, but then you realize absolutely cannot be real. So what seemed to have finally been preferred was something that leaves you in limbo about what is what, and that was our in as a class too, figuring out what the visual interest of these was. Most people hate Vasi. They think, well, everybody liked him, but he's Piranesi was really the good person. So we thought, well, this is interesting. The King of Naples really didn't like Piranesi at all. Okay. Thank you.